Hello everybody. Today we're doing video 12, and this is the Dear Moody series, which has become the Dear Moody's, Dear Fitch and Dear Standard & Poor's series. The reason for this is that Dear Moody's started off by saying, well, let's ask Moody's not to downgrade us in November, us being South Africa, to ask him not to downgrade us in November from investment status to non-investment status or junk status. And then I realized over the weekend, after meditating and praying and so on, and thinking about it more and more, as one does, that we need to ask Fitch and Standard & Poor's, the other two main international ratings agencies, to increase our status from junk status to investment grade status, for exactly the same reasons. As we're asking Moody's not to downgrade us, I'm asking Standard & Poor's and Fitch to upgrade us. So that all three of these agencies say, invest in South Africa, invest in South African citizens, invest in South African active citizens, invest in South Africa. Invest in South Africans, regardless of what our government is up to or not up to. And yes, our government has spent 500 billion rand on Eskom out of a 2.3 trillion rand budget. But I'm going to show you a spreadsheet later on. Probably not tonight. We'll get to it in a few days' time, when I get to commentary, when I showed you what I'm thinking about and what I'm talking about. That says that maybe for between 500 billion and a trillion rand, we can build out a whole new electricity grid infrastructure in South Africa, which is just phenomenal. Tonight I'm going to deal with translation. I'm going to deal with NERSA. I'm going to deal with the ISMO. I'm going to deal with Eskom status. I'm going to deal with demand response. And I'm going to look at why Medupi and Kusile are late, and the build program. So without further ado, I'm going to switch now to the first paper. And remember, the first part of this process, the first videos were about policy. The next part was law. I put that into one section called policy and law. Then there was a section after that called translation, which is what I'm on now, which is professionals commenting. And then there's commentary, people like me, and then there's hidden messages. Here's an article from 2008. And remember at the top, B means we're dealing with translation. 108 is my sequence number, so I know that getting everything in the right order. 2008 is when this happened, and this is the article, NERSA blames Eskom for power crisis. In 2008, 11 years ago, NERSA was still independent, or as independent as it could be. Today, I don't believe it's independent anymore, because it's allowing Eskom to operate outside its license condition. It's allowed Eskom in the past 10 years to increase electricity prices by 5 times. And if you look at electricity prices going back 20 years, you'll discover that the electricity prices have gone up 25 times in South Africa. From having the cheapest electricity in the world, we now have almost the most expensive electricity in the world. From having a very good and secure supply of electricity, we now have shortages. Even though we don't have load shedding, we still have shortages. So NERSA blames Eskom for power crisis. NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, has laid the blame for the current electricity crisis squarely at Eskom's doors, and has recommended private power producers and power generation capacity as means of solving the crisis. So what NERSA said is what the policy documents that we've already gone through from 1998, 2003, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008 have all said that private power producers must come into the mix. Preempting NERSA's call, the Kruger Development Corporation last week announced plans to build an independent power station costing between 5 and 6 billion rand in Nelson Mandela Bay, Port Elizabeth. We are not putting our future in the hands of Eskom. And Eskom was behind schedule. What have I written here? As far as I recall, this power station was built, never licensed, and then moved elsewhere in the world. So this company spent a huge amount of money building a power station in South Africa. It was never licensed by NERSA, even though NERSA said we want it. And then they took the power station apart and moved it elsewhere. Eskom previously indicated that the high unplanned maintenance and load losses, combined with unusually high planned maintenance of generating units, poor quality coal, wet coal, and low stockpile levels were to blame for South Africa's recent outages. The implementation of measures to provide for growth has been inadequate and slow. There have been delays and we remain behind targets. We've looked in the previous video at maintenance or lack of it, and that Eskom kept the lights on by not doing maintenance, especially from 1998 to 2003, and then they tried to catch up and they never could catch up, because once you allow these massive power stations, imagine you don't do any maintenance on your car for 5 years, and then you decide, okay, we're going to maintain it now, we're going to do oil changes, change the spark plugs. You discover that you've damaged the car beyond repair. This is what's happened to Eskom. And then we have poor quality coal. Eskom's main product is not electricity, it's ash. Look up ash dams, ASH, ash dams. Wet coal, poor quality coal, low stockpile levels. And here I've written the same problems in 2008 and in 2019. Eskom's maintenance strategy has resulted in the reduction of generation plant availability to below the 90% target. As we've seen, at this stage Eskom were already below 80%, well on their way to the current 60%. What's going to happen next year when Eskom doesn't meet their licensing requirements? Now we go to Mark Pickering. He's a professor at university talking about the ISMO, which we've also spoken about in previous law, where we looked at the ISMO, the Independent System Market Operator Law, which said that Eskom would supply the ISMO, and the ISMO would supply me, and I could supply the ISMO, and ISMO could supply Eskom, or my neighbor. This was done by the Energy Research Centre at the University of Cape Town, October 2010, and breaking news is that I've heard the Energy Research Centre is breaking down. We need to understand what's going on in South Africa. How can the Energy Research Centre at the University of Cape Town be falling apart? What's going on? This was in October 2010 when the ERC was still a fantastic institution, part of the University of Cape Town. What does Mark Pickering say? I paused for a second because my fan went on. I'm going to close what I don't have to have open. So I'm going to close this one now. We're on this one. I've got things open in the background which I'm going to go to, and we'll see. So there's Mark Pickering talks about archetypal electricity market structures. There's a so-called natural monopoly, so-called single buyer, so-called wholesale competition, so-called retail competition. And as we said before, there's no such thing as a natural monopoly. In 1910, as early as 1910 in America, in Chicago, the term natural monopoly was invented by the utility people. So they didn't have any competition. They created monopolies. And then having created monopolies, they created monopsonies, where they said if anybody else makes electricity and they've got spare capacity, because there was a lot of people making electricity at that time, they said, oh, all those people must sell electricity to them, and only them. Now, this is the South African reserve margin from 1999 to 2007. A good system should have a 15% reserve margin. The reason for this is because a good system has a 92% uptime factor, which means that the power station's up 92% of the time. Which means if you take a power station down, you've got other power stations with spare capacity who can fill in the gap. And here we were in 2007, just before the load shedding of 2008, with very low spare capacity. In the review of the 2008 load shedding, Chettiar et al. Attribute the disastrous outcome to the following problems. Low levels of maintenance, we know that. Limited capacity to withstand systemic shocks, we know that. Low stockpile levels, poor quality coal. Heavy rainfall, which made handling of coal very difficult. And the long-term primary energy contracts are structured for 60% generation load factor. It says the policy and regulatory framework of the country did not attract new independent generators. This is untrue. The policy and regulatory framework did attract new independent generators. I've said this and I'll say it again. The policy and regulatory framework of the country did attract. But the government's vacillation, the government's changing their minds, the government's changing their rules, the government's saying one thing and then doing another thing, as we've seen with NERSA in the previous article. People came along with billions. I was a relatively small player with millions. I wanted to do rooftop installations for embedded generation, according to plans that started being put in place in 2003 with the Johannesburg Agreement on climate change, and then the 2008 when the government said they're implementing feed-in tariffs, which they didn't do. And as I've said repeatedly, the policy framework is excellent. The regulatory framework is not that great. The law, which protects Eskom. But that's not the thing. The law is not difficult to change. The law changes in three ways. One, the government changes the law, or people are sleeping. Two, the general public get the law changed. And three, big business gets the law changed. For example, big business wants to do fracking, or they want to build a mine in a restricted area, a natural, beautiful area of natural beauty, and they get the law changed to allow that. Economic and electricity growth projections were underestimated. Note, underestimated. And this at a time when we saw the IRP saying that actually we need to reduce electricity production. Timely decisions not being taken. Eskom has embarked on a major new build program, which is planned to deliver close to 10 gigawatts of new capacity over the next 5 years. Medupi and Kusile were meant to have been completed by 2015. We're going to look at that in a minute. Eskom envisages a cumulative nominal capital spend of 500 billion in the 5-year period from 2010 to 2015. To put that in perspective, Eskom's total assets were valued at 199 billion the year before. And Eskom's income wasn't enough to cover this expansion. And this is normal, everybody. You have to understand that all of Eskom's power stations have to be replaced from 2010 to 2030. And a power station doesn't make a profit for 20 years. It runs at a loss. But the investors, the big banks, the international banks, the World Bank, they understand this. And so they invest in a power station which is going to last 50 years and will become profitable after about 25 years. But Eskom is trying to be profitable from day one, thus increasing the price of electricity by 25 times in 20 years, making electricity not only unaffordable for the general public, but unavailable. In 2001, Cabinet adopted a resolution that up to 30% of existing generating plants should be sold to the private sector. Well, this wasn't necessary. It didn't happen, but it also wasn't necessary because the private sector built and has built 10 gigawatts, as we've seen in a previous slide, by now. A quarter of South Africa's electricity production is in private hands already. This is on page 9 of 112 of Mark Pickering's document. I recommend you read it. Because at the moment, the government's talking about this again, and they'll be talking about it again next year. And the government is interested in protecting people who work at Eskom. They're not interested, and that's 50,000 people. They're not interested in 55 million people who need electricity for their day-to-day lives. I'm going to close this document and go to the next one. The next document is from May 2012. It says the evening peak is 30.2 gigawatts. System demand 29.8 gigawatts. Currently available 32 gigawatts. Forecast morning peak 29. Operating reserve 2.7 in the morning. But look at the evening, what happens. Expected availability 32,413. Forecast evening peak 33, which means that Eskom had 684 megawatts too little. So what did they do to solve the problem? First is emergency level 1 utilized. Second, demand market participation utilized, which means that they were using something called demand response. We're going to look at that to pay their customers to switch off. And thirdly, they would run peaking power stations. They're called gas turbines, but they run diesel. South Africa's gas infrastructure is very poor. The city of Cape Town had gas at the end of the 19th century. And if you go into some of those old houses in the city of Bol, you'll find that they have gas piped. So they were going to run these diesel power stations. And I estimated that these power stations cost 15 Rand a kilowatt hour at a time when Eskom's average price was 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Eskom told me that actually the cost was 6 Rand a kilowatt hour because they don't pay tax and they get all their diesel before tax. And of course, more than half of South Africa's diesel cost is tax. In fact, it used to be half until 4 years ago. Now it's 2/3. 2/3 of South Africa's petrol and diesel in America called gas cost is tax. Let's look at the next document. The next document is demand response from 2012. Let's go to slide 7 and then we'll go to slide 12. So this is slide 7. Slide 7 is important because it talks about facilities that were offered to big business customers and big electricity customers. So big electricity customers, including the top 40 electricity customers, and then big business. They get an Eskom model, electricity services company. They get performance contracting, standard offer, standard products, all kinds of rebates. There were rebates for private people like us and downlighters in residential, but the top 4, they were only for big business. And I'm saying, if you want to level the playing fields, you've got to give them to everybody. And if you continue with John Thorby's model, you get to this picture. And we're not going to go through the picture in detail. The picture is just to show you that Eskom really thought about demand response and was running it. And they shut down when they get told to electronically, and they collect energy and capacity payments. So they collect a payment to be available, Eskom pay for the equipment, and then Eskom pays them when they shut them down. It's called demand response. And Eskom told me at the time in 2012, if I get 50,000 homeowners to agree, Eskom would do demand response with those 50,000 homeowners. And I couldn't get 5 to agree. People are very quick to complain, very slow to actually make change. Now we're going to look at a document for 2013. This document is an Eskom presentation to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Energy update on Eskom build program. 16 pages. It says the infrastructure currently under construction will create approximately 40,000 jobs and more than 50% of the spend will be local. So they're going to take 40,000 people to build these massive power stations and bring old mothballed power stations back into service. And 40,000 jobs is not small. Please don't get me wrong. But we need 55 million people to be looked after. And the 2010 National Planning Commission report spoke of 11 million people needing work by 2030. And from 2010 to 2019, 5 million people lost their jobs. So now, between 2020 and 2030, we need to employ 16 million people. And the government in the latest Sonar State of the Nation address said they're aiming to employ 2 million people. What of the other 14 million people? Eskom spending as much as anybody. Now we need to understand that Eskom benchmarked themselves against these Italian companies. And if you go and look up Italian history, you'll discover that these companies work the same way as Eskom. They're monopolies. Eskom's a monopoly. And they've had the same problems in Italy, where they've dramatically increased the prices and got dramatically worse electricity provision and gas. We don't have gas here, but they do. So Eskom benchmarks themselves with other international utilities that are the same as them. If Eskom benchmarked themselves with a typical German utility or an American utility, they would do incredibly badly. If you're a business owner and you want to benchmark yourself, you must benchmark yourself with the best. You mustn't benchmark yourself against someone to make yourself look pretty. The Medupi execution team is targeting the first unit, which they called Unit 6, synchronization date of December 2013. And it was being affected in 5 areas. Software, there were welding problems, and there were welding problems. Let's go look at a presentation that I did in 2010, which shows Eskom building. I called it crisis management. Notice, a domestic energy independence talk that I gave in 2010. I did a whole lot of research and built these models, which said Medupi would bring 2 units on in 2012-2013 financial, which is July to June, and then in 2013-2014, 794, and would complete the project by 2015-2016. Kusile would bring their first 2 units online in 2013-2014 and would be complete by the end of 2017. Ingulef Pump Storage would also come online. They were late. These 3 mothballed power stations here that were brought back into service were late. But Medupi and Kusile, 10 gigawatts approximately, aren't finished yet, and it's 2019. And I pointed this out in 2010. I said we're going to be late. Let's look what else I've said. I did a calculation where I showed, assuming that Medupi and Kusile were online on time, which they weren't, and they're not. But if they were, this is the new build program, the red line. Here, we were at 35 gigawatts, and if demand increased by 2%, we would actually have spare capacity for a couple of years. But if demand increased by 3%, we would never catch up. And if demand increased by 4%, we'd never catch up. So what do? You stifle demand. Instead of saying, make it a free-for-all, give everybody the opportunity to make their own energy, to supply a grid with electricity as it's needed, to get to 55 gigawatts by 2020. We're never going to get there. At best, we're at 28 at the moment from Eskom. Plus, remember, 10 gigawatts of private generation, climbing rapidly. Every time I walk around Milnerton, every time I drive in Cape Town, I see more and more photovoltaic panels on roofs. More and more generators being installed. I see life, even though Eskom's dying. Here is the pollution that Eskom creates. Nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide. This is what Eskom's pumping into the air, why people are so sick in South Africa. I'm going to close the PowerPoint now so that the fan stays off. We're back here. We're expecting Medupi to be complete by 2015. We're expecting Kusile be complete by 2017. So what are we looking at? Eskom partially takes over contracted day-to-day management tasks. 9,000 faulty welds. There's a reason for this. Eskom outsourced welding to a Japanese supplier. The welding has got to be done by experienced welders with a minimum of 3 years experience. You can only weld these welds 5 times, after which you've got to throw the whole equipment away, the pipe or the boiler. And then at some point, 6 months after the build started, Eskom said, we're going to do it. We're going to train locals. And the Japanese supplier said, you're mad. You're never going to finish this plant. They were right. Kusile. The first synchronization date, 2014, could be affected. Boiler manufacturing erection progress is not meeting plan. There's welding problems. There's complexity of tunnel, trench and drainage continues. Remember what I said before? There's no economies of scale for a power station above 800 megawatts. And each of these units as Kusile, 800 megawatts. It would be more efficient, quicker and cheaper to build 6 separate power stations with much less software complexity. And it would be much better to have spent, Eskom to have spent 100 million rand building a small plant to see if they could actually make electricity at 42% efficiency when the worldwide standard is 32%. Labor unrest. Permitting challenges. Water supply challenges. Labor problems, welding problems. I'm not making this stuff up, everybody. This is documentation that's available for everybody. Let's close this document and see where we get to. Kusile's, let's just go back to Medupi first. 2014. On Monday, 15th of September, Eskom will be counting down the 100 days to the synchronization of the first Medupi power station 6 units. Colin Machila, in charge of build, said we're close to generation and that the first unit will be synchronized on the 24th of December 2014, a year and a half after schedule. Remember we said in the previous slide, 2013. Here we have, this is on the internet. Here's the internet website. Here's the other internet website that I found for you. May the 18th, 2015, 2 years late, Eskom announced that the first units of Medupi, the first unit, unit number 6, started generating at full production. Let's look at Kusile. 2017. In 2017, Medupi was meant to be finished, and Kusile was meant to be halfway. So the unit synchronized in December 2016, and 3 months later in March, achieved full production. And let's look at another article about Eskom congratulating themselves. South African Power Utility has successfully synchronized Kusile Power Stations Unit 2 on schedule. On what schedule? This is 2018, everybody. This was meant to happen in 2015. How is it possible that it's on schedule? It's not on schedule, it's not on budget. But Eskom are congratulating themselves for being on schedule. Imagine you'd make a base case for your company, for your project, and then every time the goalposts move, you move the base case. Eventually it's meaningless. You congratulate yourself when you're 3 years behind schedule and 100 billion rand over budget. We promised to perform at the highest standard and meet strict deadlines. They didn't meet the deadlines. They're late. This is on ABB's website. I'm sorry, ABB. You should be looking into this kind of thing and being more careful. I like ABB. I think they're doing good work. But I don't think that they should allow their big customer Eskom to tell them that they're on time when they're late. I'm not saying ABB's late. Maybe it wasn't their fault. Maybe it was Eskom's fault. Maybe it was the government's fault. I don't know. But we need to be careful with the information we're putting out. We have so much fake news today. We can't be having fake news from a private company. We have to be so careful. Eskom were late. And they were congratulating themselves for being on time. Can anybody see a problem with that? Thank you.